us, she migrated west to earn her MA and PhD at the University of Washington. We're in a holding pattern. Nobody heard. Sorry about missing the beginning of my talk. Write me and I'll give it to you. A little louder. All right. Is this off now? Hello. Yeah, there it is. Where was I? Okay. She earned her BA at the University of Georgia. And fortunately for us, she migrated west, earned her MA and PhD at the University of Washington. Her primary scholarship has been on zoo archaeology, focusing on the enduring relationships between people and fish, working on projects in the Pacific Northwest, Oceania, and the deserts of Western North America. Since 2010, Dr. Butler has turned more of her attention to public archaeology and education, creating and directing the Archaeology Roadshow, of which I'm sure you're all very familiar. Dr. Butler's scholarship has been published in numerous international journals, including Antiquity, Journal of World Prehistory, American Antiquity, Journal of Archaeological Science, and that's just to name a few. Her presentation tonight, updates from the Dalles Roadcut site, a sample of the stories. And I would like to introduce Dr. Butler.
Thank you, Dan. Can people hear me? Is it good? Okay. The trick will be holding this and operating this advanced laser pointer and so forth. Also in this planetarium, I feel like I might get a little dizzy, not deciding which side of the room to look at. But thank you all for coming. Thanks so much to OAS for inviting me to present this. Thanks to David Minnick. You know, he's gotten a lot of applause tonight because he helps put this program together. And he spoke to me, I think about a year ago, asking if I would give a talk. And I thought, you know, I really should. And when I thought about what to share, it really came that this is what I needed to share. I have been working on this project for a long time, as you're going to see, and I've needed to move it down the road to a final report, and this has helped me do that. So thank you all for coming. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give some regional context to the cultural background and geography and talk about the significance. I'll talk about the 1950s archaeology that took place in this area, talk about our work in 1993, a really long time ago, and the key findings from that, and highlight why this place has enduring importance to Indigenous people and us all. And I don't see any of the faces out in Zoom land, but hey, everybody, you know, I saw several people on the Zoom call, Cheryl Mack in particular, that was instrumental in this project. So I'm so glad that those of you out there are here tonight, and I'll be thinking about you and thinking that you're actually in this room. So this region, the Dalles Deschutes region of the Columbia River, it's about a 25-mile stretch of river from the town of the Dalles, which is about 90 miles upriver from where we are now. But this Dalles Deschutes region continues up to the John Day Dam. This is a map that was drawn in 1930, so it's got a lot of the old places that are now underwater and we hardly know about them anymore. This place was very significant, you know, from a geographic point of view, because there was a major elevation drop of 25 meters from the John Day Dam down to the Dalles. And this created an extraordinary number of waterfalls and rapids that made it a very, very special place before the Dalles Dam went in and submerged all of this. So what I've just shown is should be a very familiar picture if you live in this area of Celilo Falls in the 1950s before that dam. Just an extraordinary place. And you've probably seen photographs of Celilo more than any when we think about this part of the Columbia and what it used to look like. But the part of the this stretch that we're going to talk about more is down closer to the town of the Dalles. And this is what's called the Long Narrows or 5 Mile Rapids. And during low water in the summer and fall, the river would go from being about 1,000 feet or 1,500 feet wide and sometimes and converge into a passage of about 100 feet, 150 feet wide. So just an extraordinary compression of the mighty Columbia. And if you're not familiar with just how mighty this river is, it drains an area about the size of France. You know, it is big. Just think about that, channeling through this very small, narrow slot. Oh, it's not. Okay. Well, the other people aren't seeing it. Okay, I need to be some comedian right now, telling jokes.
All yours.
Do you think it's sharing?
Yeah.
Well, I'm not seeing anything.
It's not
Oh.
sharing for us.
Oh, Julie, I feel for you. This is just like what would happen in a classroom. And I would look like an idiot in front of all these students that knew exactly how all the tech worked.
Here comes the cavalry, Julia. Or whatever it's worth.
Bear with us. We're just dealing with one technical difficulty. We'll get this back up for you. Thank you. Sorry.
Oh, a question about the Archaeology Roadshow. Thank you. Thank you very much. We have a date for the Portland event, and it's going to be Saturday, May 31st. We're shifting things this year. We've had it downtown on PSU campus since its beginning, and we're shifting to East Portland. We're going to the Gateway Discovery Park, which is at about 105th and Halsey. So we're looking forward to kind of putting the roadshow on the road in Greater Portland. We don't have that set up. We did have an event at the Discovery Center in November. Oh, okay. Well, send me an email and I'll put you on our email list and you'll get all the words. In fact, if any of you want updates on the Archaeology Roadshow, where it's happening, when it's going to happen, how to volunteer, you can email me at virginia@pdx.edu. It's one of the simplest emails out there. Yeah. Okay, another question? Oh, okay. The Archaeology Roadshow is effectively a multi-hour fair where archaeologists and heritage specialists that work for private companies, federal agencies, tribes, museums get together and share with the public what they're doing, what's going on. Every year we pick a different and we tell the local stories about archaeology and projects through a theme.
Gave a presentation, I think, on Port Angeles a number of years ago.
I did.
Any new on
Oh,
that? You're not prepared.
no, I'm really not. But that's okay. No, I mean, there's things that are really happening in the Salish Sea. One thing I learned about the Lower Elwha Clallam tribe and the Squamish tribe are trying to get a law passed in the state of Washington to prevent pins, the fish farming in the waters off in the Puget Sound. Doesn't have anything to do with archaeology, but has a lot to do with tribes and fisheries. That's really important to me. So, and you know, I will say that because I think I wasn't able to fit that into the talk, but one of the things that's I think happening more and more are tribes are pressing more on federal and state agencies and the general public to take care of resources. They're appealing to a part of our society that just hasn't been appealed to in the way it needs to. It looks like it's sharing. I don't know how they can. Someone unmute and say whether you're seeing it or not and hearing it. Anyone in Zoom land?
I'm seeing it in Zoom land.
Looks okay.
Thank you.
I just see the update, the title page,
Okay.
if that's where
So-
you are.
Right. What?
We can, I can edit.
You know, I think that I hate to say it to Zoom land people, but I'm going to move ahead to the. You won't miss too much, and maybe you heard me before. I don't know. I've got a pretty long talk here, and I'm going to move forward. I'm going to be brutal here, but we're talking about the region of importance, this Dalles Deschutes area. I was talking about Celilo Falls that we're very familiar with. This other section is the Long Narrows, which is especially important for this project because of the archaeological site located next to it, but all a very important area. And why, was it important? Well, salmon were the real draw here. In the time before development, before 1860, an estimated 16 million salmon used to make their way up the Columbia through these waters that I've just been describing. And they could be caught with relative ease in the chutes and gullies that were part of these rapid systems. People created ingenious ways of capturing the fish by building platforms out to the water. And I say they could be caught with relative ease. Yes, but these were very dangerous places too. And people lost their lives often. You can see most people are tied up with ropes. Lots and lots of energy flowing right here. But these dip nets were used to bring the fish up. A very, very important area for fishing. And again, the Celilo Falls area got most of the attention from historic photographs, but here's a picture of the Long Narrows, just upriver from the town of the Dalles, which the archaeological site I'm going to talk about is closest to. very important to explorers who came to this area in the 19th century. They commented, they were astounded by the fishery they saw in the Dalles region. Here's an illustration by Paul Kane, a Canadian that was in the area in the 1840s, and he drew this picture of fish being dried at the head of the Long Narrows. Was just astounded by the scale of drying racks, of the community construction that was used to support, that is, fish were caught and dried, and it was clearly a major undertaking. And the other important thing that was mentioned and is part of this story is that there's a lot of wind that moves through this part of the gorge, and that was a very effective way of drying the fish. This area historically was known as a major trading area, very important trade network. This illustration shows salmon being at the core, and this is this region that we're talking about. People would come from all over the Northwest, bringing whatever they had in their area to the Dalles, and then trade what they had, get salmon, maybe get things from other partners that were in the area. Very, very important trading area. And then one of the explorers in 1849 wrote that it was this Long Narrows was a great emporium or mart of the Columbia. During midsummer, there might be 3,000 Indians at the camp at the head of the Narrows, this place that I'm talking about. Major, major area of importance. It was also a sacred landscape. It was very important and fundamental to people's view of why they lived and why they existed. And this photograph by Carlton Watkins is just a gorgeous illustration of the majesty of this area, I will say. This is the head of the Long Narrows. This is where that river constricts. This is the Oregon side. This is the Washington side. This is where that mart was, the emporium. Lots of archaeological sites in this area that have very elaborately made artifacts, clearly tied to the sacred and religious, and many petroglyphs found. Some of them are still found and above the water line, above the area that is now inundated. But many of the petroglyphs were submerged when the Dalles Dam was built and waters backed up behind it. This is an illustration from one of Jim Kaiser's book. It's standing right here. Lots of expertise in this room. And the meaning of these symbols I'm not familiar with, and it's really part of a tribal story to tell, but it is very clear that this place had a very sacred significance to people living in this area. Now, settler colonialism in the 19th, 20th century really shattered this world. You know, in addition to disease transmission, population loss, people being taken off land, people being forced into boarding schools, people having their religion taken away. Those are kind of the usual list of horrible things that happened to indigenous people in North America. In this particular area, let's add another important thing, and that is the dams that were put in along the Columbia and many other tributary rivers. Very important for power generation, very important for flood control, very important for navigation in certain areas. I mean, there's lots of important reasons why dams have been very important to the Western world in our area. But it really did shatter indigenous lifeways in the Dalles area in the form of building this dam that then backed up water and submerged these sacred sites, the fisheries, many archaeological sites. So here's an example just from the Long Narrows that illustrates the inundation effect. So here's the dam here, and the light color is, and the blue together is the reservoir that's now behind the Dalles Dam, and the red marks indicate either places of cultural significance or archaeological sites that are now underwater. Now, I've shared some of this sad story just to let you appreciate kind of where we begin when we try to put this together. It's not just looking back in time and thinking about the interesting archaeology. This impact from the dam had very real implications to people that live in this area. And so it's kind of important just to carry that and be aware of it. And it also, I wanted to express just how important this area was to people. And you can learn and kind of educate yourself about some of this by looking at a couple of very important publications. In the winter of 2007, the Oregon Historical Society, the Oregon Historical Quarterly, published a series of papers that were part of the commemoration of the construction of the Dalles Dam that went in 1957. So it really, this compilation includes lots of reflections by Native Americans, scholars, about the importance of the dam from just the way it affected people who live there and have a stake in it. Another more personal reflection that I think is so good is George Aguilar's When the River Ran Wild. This is a very short little book by the University of Washington Press put out. George Aguilar was a young man, a young child actually, in the 20s and 30s, and he and his grandparents lived right on the Long Narrows in the 30s and 40s up until had connections to it up until the time the dam went in. So, you know, I think I can talk about how I think it would have hurt people. Sometimes it's just useful to read these reflections from the voices themselves. But ahead of that dam, there was a lot of archaeology that was going on to salvage records that would be inundated, that would be lost when the floodwaters built up around the dam. And the Oregon side of the river here was studied by people from the University of Oregon. Luther Cressman was a major, kind of the father of Oregon archaeology, and he brought a team of people. They worked for some time, both at this place called Roadcut that I'm going to talk about, but they also did work over by the dam and, you know, testing in other places. And the University of Washington tested in many places in here, as well as other people that were involved in that project. So there was a lot of work done ahead of that dam. Now, here's a photograph of Luther Cressman's project after he finished the effort, and you can see from the scale we've got a human here. This is a really big, thick deposit, over 7.8 meters thick. This archaeological site, and the braces here indicate, based on radiocarbon dates, there are records that date between about 10,000 and 6,000 years ago. Now, this car here is indicating this is a former Highway 30. Highway 30 was here, then it bounced here, and now Highway 30 has been incorporated into Interstate I-84. But this is called the Roadcut site because it was found when fish remains were eroding out of this road cut, and an engineer that was walking around and inspecting the bank saw these fish remains and contacted the University of Oregon, and that started really targeting this work for at this particular location. So just to give you a rundown of some of the important findings from that 1950s work, this is a graph that came out of the Cressman's publication in 1960. And what I start out with are the radiocarbon dates. He collected many of them, and some of them go back almost 10,000 years radiocarbon up to about 6,000 years radiocarbon. And we now know that you can calibrate these ages, and so this oldest date could be close to about 12,000 calibrated years. Also, a lot of stone tools came out. I mean, it was a major archaeological site, and these graphs indicate relative proportion of some of these stone tools according to the levels that these were found. So this is the uppermost part of the site, and then this is the deepest part of the site. And so you can see a lot of stone tools, especially in this deeper part of the site. a lot of fish bones, as I've mentioned. And this is this bulge right here, again, the deeper part of the site. And Cressman didn't study these in detail, but he estimated that there were close to 250,000 salmon bones from this archaeological site. And that was estimated, I mean, literally using a coffee can, a large coffee, bucket, not a bucket, but a 2 or 3 pound coffee dispenser container. He poured bones in there and estimated from that how many fish remains were in the project area. Really phenomenal. In addition, there was a lot of unusual birds from gull, cormorant, eagle, condor, raven, crow, a lot of interesting bird bones that also were found in those deeper layers. That's going to come in a moment. These findings were important for a lot of reasons. It was one of the first archaeological sites in our region to be dated using radiocarbon. Cressman was very connected nationally. You may know he was married to Margaret Mead in his early years. He ran with a pretty big crowd, and he was connected to Libby, who was the in a sense discoverer of the radiocarbon dating method. And so Cressman wiggled his way into getting some radiocarbon dates, and there you have it. It established the great antiquity of people living and fishing in our area, and it was the source of a commonly heard expression, 10,000 years of fishing on the Columbia. But questions emerged. Could the fish remains in this archaeological site be natural? Might they not be the representation, may they not be from human fishing? And we're going to talk about that, okay? So, when fish come in high abundance, they spawn in certain areas and then they die. And then the idea might be is that these fish carcasses could wash up to a riverbank and get deposited. And then thousands of years go by and they appear to look like they were part of an archaeological site. You could think about this could be a place where they might have camped in an area. People might have salvaged the salmon that washed up. There were just questions about the possibility that these fish could come from spawned out fish. We also wonder, or people started to wonder, could they be the meals of fish-eating birds or mammals? There's a very high concentration of scavenger birds, condor, gull, birds that people don't usually eat, but those birds do eat fish. So there was a question about whether there was something related to these fish-eating birds contributing to the fish bone deposit in the archaeological site. And as I mentioned, there were the remains of these creatures in the archaeological site. So I'll say that at this time, in the late 60s, 70s, and 1980s, there came to be a general questioning within archaeology about what we call taphonomy. How do deposits form? How do bone deposits form? To what extent are they natural? Do they just develop because of natural processes? And to what extent are they result of human activity? And because the site was as important as it was, I decided that more work needed to be done to resolve this debate, to try to figure out, could the bones be natural or cultural? So I got a very small grant from the National Geographic Society. It didn't seem that small then, but $25,000, but when I look at that amount now, I think, whoa, we did a lot for a very little amount of money, a real shoestring deposit. And I returned to the site in May and June of 1993 for further testing with a team of volunteers and with pretty narrow goals. We wanted to relocate the site. We wanted to dig a small step trench through the site down that face to obtain a sample of faunal remains and sediment samples to figure out how the fish bones got there. So here is so we returned to the field for 6 weeks, and I did see Cheryl Mack out there, so in the Zoom land. So there's Cheryl, one of our stalwart volunteers, Jackie Chung, Eric Gleason, Susan Freiberg. These people were there for almost every day of that 6 weeks to help this come together. And many other people came for several days to a week, listed there: Dave Cole, Chris Smith, Chris Wade Thomas, my husband Andrew Fountain over here, Jim Chatters, Natalie Cataray, Scott Stumke. You know, we were really doing the archaeology of the archaeology because we were relocating that site and digging a trench through it. I want to kind of take you through the context of, in a sense, how we found the site and how much the land around it had changed. And here's an aerial photograph from 1935 that shows this is the entrance to the Long Narrows, that orange bar. And then here is a arc over a basalt cliff behind the archaeological site. And we figure, based on the work that Cressman did and so forth, we knew the site was basically here, just up from what is known as Celilo Canal. That was a ship canal that allowed ships and barges to get portaged around that rapid in the 19th and early 20th century. When you go to the late 1970s, here's where the archaeological site is. Again, you can still see the arc marking the entrance to the Long Narrows, again, basically underwater, and then this green arc indicating that basalt hill behind us. And so here's the archaeological site that is up from the Celilo the portage, the Celilo Canal, now filled with water. No boats are portaging through there. Though I'll say that one time while we were excavating, there was a little boat. Some people were fishing in this little lake, and they boated by and waved to us, and we explained what we were doing. But the challenge to this archaeological site, and maybe why it's been retained and saved, is that it's locked between the east and westbound lanes of Interstate 84, a very challenging place to carry out an archaeology project, as you can imagine. But before I move forward, I want to say that Dave Cole, a graduate student of Cressman's, who I had been in contact with, sent me a map that showed us where the archaeological site was on today's footprint, so we could go to it and know we were going to be basically in the same place that Cressman had been working. So here's the beginning of the project. Someone is standing basically right above that water and looking up at the top, and then we're clearing trees and vegetation so we can move on the project, laying out a grid. Beginning the contact, beginning excavating. So at the very top of the hill, we put in a 2x2 meter unit and started shoveling it out. And that sounds like very controlled excavation, just taking shovels and shoveling out. What we realized almost immediately was that the top layers of this were very disturbed. There was cigarette butts, there were parts of shirts, shoes, lots of very modern garbage associated with these upper layers. It was a very root-rich, very, I'll say frothy, very open structure, clearly not primary context. So we kept moving down from that top and literally shoveling out. We were screening because there were some stone tools in this that were clearly disturbed and mixed up, so we didn't want to lose those, but we didn't do fine-scale excavation in this part of the project. We simply kept moving down and down, and our goal was to get deeper into this step face because that's where the fish bones were. We needed to get to the geology and the context to answer the question about the fish bones, so we needed to really be sampling those deeper units. So we kept moving down, and this is a picture, if this is at the top of the hill looking down towards the water, and this is disturbed fill. You can see there's a lot of it. And this is the primary context that was very modeled. It was very I'm trying to think of the word for this, but scoured. It was not a flat, we were not coming down on the excavation surfaces of Cressman's project. Nothing neat and tidy about that. But as we were doing our shovel skimming, we came upon a lithic scatter right here, and I'll report on some of the materials we got there. And then we hit a hearth, a cluster of clear charcoal that we bagged and submitted for a radiocarbon date. And then we kept moving downward so that we would get to this deeper, older part of the archaeological site we needed to work on. So here's another picture looking back up the hill towards, it's like this is this picture right here looking down. I'm now pointing upward, and I was standing up there just a minute ago to take that other picture. And this is the nature of that surface that we were effectively shoveling the secondary deposit out of. And we're now standing in one of the main excavation unit that we spent our time in. So here's what this 2x2 meter unit looked like as we did our very controlled, careful excavation in. And then when we kept moving down through this pretty homogeneous yellow-brown sand, we got finer and finer sediments, more and more organics, more and more bone. We knew we were coming into the layers that we needed to really spend our time on. Unfortunately, we had spent a lot of time getting to this point, and we couldn't keep going down on this square to get to the deepest units. So we basically turned a right angle. I'm going to show you here. So the next picture that I'm going to show, the next picture I'm going to show you is looking right here, okay? This is a 2x2 meter unit. We turned and went down and put a 1x1 meter unit in right there. And so to illustrate, that's what this unit is. And because we wanted to get deeper and deeper, we wanted to get more fish remains, we wanted to get the charcoal and all the context that we would want to get. And the other reason why it's good to just go into a different unit, really go into a step, is that now we have a wall of this excavation unit, so that we can look at the stratigraphy of what was in this unit, as opposed to just continuing down in that one place. Also, there was a real danger of wall collapse. So steps made it very, much more safer operation. And I will say that Eric Gleason got very handy with building a shoring with big sheets of plywood. No danger. I was glad OSHA wasn't out there for that. But this is looking down at the bottom of this 1x1 meter excavation unit. A lot more and more organics. Kind of different character of the sediment. And at one point, we hit basically the waterlogged deposits. We could not get any further. And Cressman went over almost 2 meters deeper than what we were able to get, but he was working before the Dalles Dam went in, before the floodwaters came up. So we were basically getting close to where the Dalles Reservoir is the groundwater is coming up from that. So the next step is correlating the excavation that we did, our testing, against Cressman's. And these beautiful graphs I am not responsible for. Jim O'Connor, my colleague here to my right, is the creator of this. But what we needed to do was match the elevations of our work to the elevations of Cressman's work, and then read closely Cressman's descriptions of geologic units and compare them to our descriptions. And based on that close analysis, we have determined that we basically intersected the focus, that 2x2 that I was referring to, hit this material right here in his yellow sand, his hard pan, and then we went down into these units right here. And if we pull it back over here, kind of expand it, this is a cartoon of our excavation area, showing the deepest part of the site that we were able to study, and then up into these other units. And one thing I'm not going to be able to talk about tonight is this feature 2, which was a large pit feature that we encountered. And fascinating, lots of interesting aspects to it. Hardly any fish remains, so it wasn't really helpful for my my National Geographic grant, but really important stories, and I'll talk to you a little bit more about that in a minute. So chronology, we got 9 radiocarbon dates, and I've positioned them here approximately in elevation where they were found, and these are just the midpoints of the calibrated age. That lithic scatter and charcoal scatter that we caught when we were shovel skimming out that trench, that provided a date of about 5,200 years ago, calibrated. This feature is dated to about 7,700 years calibrated. And then the yellow-brown sand, the radiocarbon dates about 8,700 years. And then a series of dates in this lower unit come out to about 8,700 years ago. Overall, the ages that we got were consistent with the radiocarbon dates that Cressman provided. Again, suggesting we were matching up our units pretty closely. He did have an older date, but he went down almost 2 meters deeper than we did. So that makes sense in that way. The other interesting thing to point out is the ages for these units, 8,700, 8,720. Basically, we have about a 3-meter deposit that has overlapping radiocarbon dates. It's hard within the radiocarbon dating method to distinguish human occupation. So in a sense, in radiocarbon ages, it's an instant of time. And we know people were probably coming back and depositing and coming back and depositing, but the action of certain dunes, like there could have been a dune that just shifted in maybe over a weekend, it really sped up the deposition of this particular block that we were studying. And I think that was all I wanted to say. Oh, the other thing that I wanted to mention to help in a sense, bring all of the cultural records together, I took the radiocarbon dates and the character of the cultural materials in the sediments and created something called an analytic unit, which basically combines these geologic strata into meaningful units that are going to be useful for saying what is changing through time. So for example, this AU4, Analytic Unit 4, it combines Unit 3, 2, and 1, which may seem like a lot, but the radiocarbon dates are all overlapping, so not too much of a story there. But the character of these units was very different from this yellow-brown sand. So it sort of made intuitive sense to create a separate analytic unit for that. And then this feature, completely different from the other parts of the site that we were studying. And then this very small lithic scatter, very different. And so very different characters of these analytic units. They're not the same in volume or anything, but they provide a handy way of comparing and contrasting the stone tools that I'm going to talk about, the plant tissues, and so forth. So you'll be seeing those in just a minute. The fauna remains. Got a fair number of them, close to 6,100 animal bones. Almost all of them were fish, and almost all of them were salmonids. We did not get any of those gull, condor, eagle, did not get any of those large birds, none of the other larger mammals, a few amphibian, a few small reptiles, but fish really is the story in the materials that we excavated. And most of them are from that analytic unit 4 that I was referring to in the deepest part of the site, again, that matches Cressman's story. I'll say that there wasn't any sign of digestion or animal processing of those bones that would suggest they were the product of animal scavenging. There weren't any talons, there weren't any claw marks, bite marks, sign of digestive erosion that these animal bones had gone through the tract of another creature. They did not show that, which suggests that it's that's lending this idea that people are responsible for these fish bones. And then a thesis came out in 2003 from from Washington State University, Victoria Hensel Kuhn, had studied the bird bones from the 1950s project, and she found that many of them were being formed into artifacts, different kinds of, they had showed girdling and chop marks. So some of it was butchering, but some of it appeared to be turning these bird bones into tools or some other important object. Again, lending this to this idea that the bird bones were cultural, and then the fish bones are going to be cultural too. Now, the geoarchaeology is another way to go at this question of fishbone origin, and it goes like this. If it especially tries to tease out this idea, do these fish bones, do they represent carcasses that washed in, or fish remains themselves that washed in from after natural death and deposition? And the way you can get at that is to look at the sediment that's encasing those fish bones. Basically, if the sediment that is casing the fish bones is windblown, if it's an aeolian origin, then that gets rid of the spawned out fish that got washed in. And one way you can start to figure out how did the dirt get into an archaeological site is to look at the relative representation of sand, silt, and clay. Wind and water treat grains very differently. They sort them differently. They have different concentrations of those grain sizes. And we had access to, or Jim O'Connor and others, I think, gathered up a dune sand that we, from close to where the Dalles Roadcut site is, we had multiple fluvial samples that the Corps of Engineers had records for. And then we had the archaeological samples that we obtained. And basically what this shows is these fluvial, these known, absolutely clear waterborne deposits have much less sand and a lot higher concentrations of silt and clay. And the aeolian sample has much higher concentrations of sand and much less silt and clay. And then when you array the archaeological particle size samples that we got, they show a much stronger connection to the wind than they do the water. And again, you know, multiple lines of evidence. That's what archaeologists are looking for. And this particular line of evidence suggests the fish didn't get there by water. And then the other way to get at this is to look at historic flood frequencies and the likelihood that past Columbia River flood levels got to the level of the road cut itself. And this came from work that Jim O'Connor did, particularly with this archaeological site. I mean, Jim does a lot of flood frequency and flood analysis on the Columbia. And basically what he did was create a cross section of the channel, basically where the road cut site is. So it's up here. And then we've got the typical low flows of the Columbia down in this channel. Think about the long narrows. And then what's arrayed here are the maximum range of annual flows of the Columbia right here. And you can draw a line here and see that it is possible that the deepest level of the road cut was that the Columbia River left its floodwaters in the deepest level of the site, but not the levels that had a lot of fish bones. And so, again, using that line of evidence, it reduces the likelihood that those fish bones have a waterborne origin. So what does that leave us is the fish bones are likely to be cultural. Address that question, and you're probably all thinking, that couldn't have been much of a question anyway. But I tell you, at that time, there was a lot of debate about this, and you just want to take care of business. You want to decide and kind of be more definitive about what is going on at such an important archaeological site. And so that work suggests that people were fishing for salmon 9,000 years ago. And I say 9,000, it could have been 10,000, it could have even been longer ago than that. We don't have the radiocarbon dates to establish that. And because Cressman's records are a little murky for those deeper units, it's just not clear. So because when you do archaeology, you have to deal with everything that you collect, not just the things that you really needed to collect for your research proposal. We need to do that other work, and lithics are a very important part of archaeology globally in non-Western worlds. Stone tools are crucial for people in making a living, in building houses, and in processing foods, and just taking care of business. And stone tools were a very important part of lifeways in our part of the world as well. And so from that stepped excavation that we did, we recovered about almost 1,618 separate pieces of stone tool stone objects. Most of those are debitage. Most of those are flakes, shatter, that have a story to tell. And I have in another talk, I have some information about that. But what I'm going to focus on, and I will actually include some of my results about that debitage, but right now I want to say that there were 132 what we call formed objects. Objects including like fine-grained chip tools that were bifaces, pretty carefully worked. Some of them were rougher, some of them were later stage. We also collected what's probably a cascade point or part of one, which in other parts of the Columbia has dated to 8,000 to 9,000 years ago. We also had a bunch of things that we called heavy tools, cobble tools, pretty massive river cobbles that people took a few flakes off of, and that would have been used for more heavy operations, pounding fish, pounding steaks, less about cutting and more about more heavy action. And one of the things that I wanted to look at was what kind of toolstone is in this sample. We often want to know, are people, in part it's because different types of toolstone are often used for different types of function, or it could tell us where people are getting their toolstone. Are they getting it from long distance? Are they getting it locally? So these stone tools and debitage were divided up into different tool stones indicated here: basalt, chert, obsidian, and so forth. I want to say I'll have 2 or 3 graphs that show the relative proportion of these different tool stones from the youngest analytic unit, that one at the very top, to the lowest. And I just want you to appreciate that each bar is basically a proportional representation of those tool stones from the bottom to the top. And one of the things that comes out right away is chert is the dominant, this cryptocrystalline silicate worldwide. Where there's chert, people have picked it up and found a way to use it. But what we also see are some trends in the types of basalt that is relatively more common in the deeper parts of the site, and get a little less common, little increase there at the end. But the overall trend is more basalt, less basalt, and quartzite, a metamorphic rock that was very important for kind of some of these heavy operations, heavy tool use, tends to get to decline in the upper units. I also looked at traditional category, that is these fine grain chips versus heavy tools, the flake shatter core. And this flake shatter, that, as I mentioned, there was over 1,400, 80% or more of the stone artifacts are in this category. So not surprisingly, they dominate. But there is still some interesting trends. These heavy tools are more prominent in AU4, get a little less common, and then they're not in that upper analytic unit at all. And the fine grain chipped stays pretty consistent from the bottom to the top. Not surprising, but it was something to look at and think about. Another characteristic of the stone is the cortex. And I think of this as kind of the skin of the rock. And a good way of thinking about cortex, probably the easiest way to think about it, is these river cobbles that are river rounded, clearly eroded and rounded by river action. They are completely covered in the parent cortex of that river rounded modification. But when someone picks that up and they start chipping it, they remove a flake, and then we expose the core, the inside of the original cobble. And if another flake comes off, we're getting deeper into that core and or into that objective piece, and there's less and less of that cortex. Identifying what kind of cortex and how much of your material has cortex at all gives you an idea of where the tool maker is in their sequence of making tools. If you have a lot of cortex, that means that you are early in the manufacturing stage. If you have less, it means you've moved into the tool making sequence. So it is important that we have a lot of materials that have cortex, and 87% of the objects that are from this site have water-worn cortex, which is really indicating people are making use of these river cobbles nearby. And one of the striking trends, though, is that, again, bottom AU4, top AU1, is the presence of that cortex gets less frequent through time. And then again, that upper unit a little bit more again, but still the overall trend is less of it. And with the idea that people are, the tool making sequence is happening a little bit later in the manufacturing, later in time. Lithic size, the last characteristic I want to talk about. And we measured lithic size using weight, which is a pretty accurate and reliable way of estimating the size of something. You can't really go wrong by a measure. And what we've got here is measured in grams, and this is 0 grams and 40 grams. Again, AU4, AU1. What this is plotting is the mean and the confidence interval surrounding the objects in a given analytic unit. So in AU4, the lithics measure between, most of them between 11 grams or 12 grams and about 28 grams, with a mean of about 20 grams. And then not a little bit bigger in AU3, but when we go to AU2 and 1, really small. Very small. So it's matching that idea of as people are working their stone more and more later in the sequence, the objects themselves are getting smaller. So really striking shifts through time for a very small sample through this impressive archaeological site. The lithics get smaller, there's less cortex, there's fewer lithics made of basalt and quartzite. And, you know, it's later in time, people are investing, more of that tool production is happening later in the sequence. Just be thinking in these lower areas, people are taking those river cobbles, they're walking to the archaeological site, and they're starting to flake them right there. And all of the products of that manufacturing sequence are ending up in that archaeological site. When we get up to this pit feature, and here, not so. Not so. What is getting deposited is a later, it's later in that sequence of manufacturing. Obsidian sources, sourcing. There was only 8 total obsidian flakes in this from the site, and Cressman didn't have much obsidian either. So that is one place that we match. Only 6 obsidian flakes were large enough to be analyzed using XRF, a very important way of fingerprinting, of figuring out where the obsidian comes from. And to say what the size of this is, most of these were about the size of my thumbnail, so very small. So if we go back to that manufacturing sequence, the obsidian was coming in late in the manufacturing sequence. They weren't coming in with big blocks of obsidian and starting to flake make it. So very, very small. And what was particularly important is even though only 6 flakes were sourced, they come from 3 different sources. Inman Creek, which is a deposit, and it's a little bit iffy and a little unclear about what that is. It's not a bedrock source. It seems to be a source that has kind of secondarily made its way into some of these tributaries of the upper Willamette. Obsidian Cliffs, many of you might have been down there, beautiful area in the Three Sisters area. And then a flake from Dooley Mountain, which is in the Blue Mountains. 6 flakes and 3 sources. That's just phenomenal to me. And it's even though it's a small sample, it's striking, and it suggests that people visited the Dalles from distant locales, a long time ago. And what were they doing? Were they fishing? Were they coming to trade? Were they there to meet potential mates? Probably all of that. But it's very cool to think that those 6 obsidian flakes kind of give us a window into that kind of connectedness that we saw evidence for in the historic period. Plants, when I started this work, Nancy Stenholm did the analysis of 9 flotation samples. She did a great job documenting many edible species, fuel wood, more, other kinds of plant taxa. These are just on the beginnings of the implications for this. But one of the things that is clear when we look at the elderberry and the chokecherry, the hazelnut, that there's an indication of season of gathering. When were people coming to this area? Hazelnuts ripen in August, September, chokecherry, July, August, elderberry, late June to August. All of this is suggesting this kind of centering in on this area at the same time that salmon would be coming in mass up the Columbia. So all of this is kind of is part of that piece. And I'll say elderberry, I don't know if there's any people really familiar with plants in the crowd, but I've been doing just a little bit of reading. It is a very toxic plant that requires very careful processing to make it edible. And I just think about 9,000 years ago, we are seeing that kind of local, intimate knowledge and understanding about how to carefully use plants. And we're seeing that at an early record such as this. So to take home, people were definitely salmon fishing at the Dalles some 9,000 years ago. The archaeological records from other parts of the Columbia Plateau and even broader suggest that people at this time were what we call broad spectrum foragers, that involved family groups, probably moving from resource to resource as they became abundant or as they ripened. And it was a place to, let's use this resource for a few weeks. Let's go over and use this one for a few weeks. But the salmon fishery at the Long Narrows was one exceptionally productive place on the landscape that drew people from long distances to do the fishing and to engage in all the social and economic activities associated with that. Salmon was probably that first order draw, but people were likely taking advantage of food webs such as the fish-eating birds, other mammals that were there at that time. And as I've mentioned, those other creatures were there, and those loved salmon too. And so people were taking advantage of that food web. So, thank you for spending this, maybe longer than an hour. I haven't even looked at my watch lately, but to let me, just give you another sense of the linkage that people have to a place on the landscape. I think we can all learn something about the importance of place and holding enduring connections to those places. This absolutely does it. We know that this is an engraving that was done by Stanley, who was on the railroad expedition in the 1850s in this area, and he stopped at the entrance to the Long Narrows. This is what we call 5 Mile Bar, which is it was shown in some of those aerial photographs, but it was exposed at low water. And we're looking into that miraculous and amazing entrance to the Long Narrows. People are fishing, they're doing some drying of fish or something, about to push off on the canoe, just the kind of everyday life that was happening on the river at that time in 1853. So almost to the year 100 years later, Luther Cressman and the University of Oregon are working a couple of 100 meters downriver from this and stumble upon this record of fishing going back 9,000 years. It just is breathtaking. The extent of enduring connections that the archaeology combined with indigenous reflections, it provides that kind of close connection that is hard to get in almost any other way. One of the things that I've thought about, there's lots of ways to take this, but I think of resilience, okay? And I think I can get through this. Resilience of the Native Americans who are continuing to exercise their sovereignty over fisheries, cultural resources, in spite of all the challenges. The salmon that are continuing to be resilient and to provide for us in spite of all the challenges. And the resilience of that archaeological site between the east and westbound lanes of Interstate 84. It is still there. And I think it will still be there when there are no cars anymore and there is no longer an I-84. Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead and thank you so much. Thank you so much, actually. It's amazing to think that 9,000 years of history is just, and life is just hidden under what I saw as, a road cut, So it's great to see a more vibrant picture. Now is the time for people to have Q&A. If there's any questions back there and Zoom, and of course here at OMSI, please key in, put it in the chat. I'll see if I can get my technological abilities back so that I can look at the chat and answer questions from Zoom. Meanwhile, I think we have, it looks like we have a question up front here with Jim.
So Virginia, Wake 'em Up Mound, which is kind of right
Yes,
across the
yes.
river from that, was all full of carved items and effigy things. Any of that found in Cressman's dig at Roadcut?
No. And, I'd say that one reason is probably his stuff is a lot older. Walk 'em Up is a lot younger. But Jim is referring to, and this is part of that sacred landscape, the area across and Walk 'em Up Mound on the Washington side, what is now Horse Thief State Park. That really was a sacred place. And there are lots of sites with burials and, just very important places. So I speak of that with real gravity and respect. But I think one of the reasons why that is not in the road cut is there's almost like a 5,000-year gap in time.
All right. We have a question here, front row.
Yes, I noticed in your cross-section of your stratigraphy, you show a charcoal stain. Is that result from fish processing, or is that an ancient brush fire? And also on the bottom, sediments on the furthest bottom, is that Missoula flood deposits?
So good. Thank you, Harvey. Those are good questions. The first one is there were some stains, what we called carbon bands. In some references, it's referred to as paleosols. We're not really sure what that is. The paleobotanist, Nancy Stenholm, noticed that it wasn't like charcoal. It's not just a burned surface, but it appears to be fragments of roots and plants that, I don't really know what that means in terms of cultural use. It could be that people put a mat down when they were there, and that disintegrated and left the remnants of that. I don't know. I don't think it doesn't appear to be a paleosol in terms of an actual horizon where there was a stable surface and, in a traditional soil nomenclature. So still investigating that. And I appreciate that question. I need to do more thinking on that. But the very bottom layer, and I should bring Jim up on this one, but we know that the Missoula floods were coming through this area, and the last one to come through was around 14,500, something like that. Those are older by the earliest dates that Cressman has by 2,000 years. But, who knows that there may not have been that much deposition in that area. It could be that the boulders in there are associated with Missoula floods. We know that the Missoula floods carved the channel, the Long Narrows. You should have Jim O'Connor back to give a talk about some of that stuff. But there you have it. Okay.
All right, we got another question here.
Is there any evidence of sturgeon being fished for by native populations?
Oh, thank you so much. So I didn't get any sturgeon, or we didn't, in the 1993 field testing, but I actually did my dissertation looking at the fish remains that Cressman had excavated, and there were some sturgeon in there, as well as other minnows and suckers. So those records need to be brought into this whole story about what was happening at this time. So it is an interesting component, because we know sturgeon have a long history in our area too. And I keep talking about salmon like they're the only game in town, but in many archaeological sites on the Columbia, sturgeon is as important as salmon. So thank you.
Another question here.
Yes, I have a question. I'm always interested in the activity of railroads where you're excavating, and along that road cut, there's a Union Pacific line that predates any roads. What activity was there before the road cut that you can't excavate because the railroad easement is there?
Good point. I mean, there's something that's called a shoe fly that is on the kind of, if you're looking to the north, on the backside to the south of that hill that we were digging from is a railroad cut, and you can see dynamite holes, places where that was actually blasted out. There was probably archaeology all over that place that has been obliterated by the various developments that have happened, including the railroad. So that Celilo Canal in front, I mean, really, it'd be hard to walk that 25-mile stretch of river and not find evidence of archaeology. So I don't have an answer to that. At the time that those railroads were being put in, the legislation, the protection of archaeology wasn't there. Certainly tribes didn't have the clout to say don't do that, so a lot's been lost.
In the first map, you showed ponies being traded from the east. Was there any evidence of horses or ponies either in your work or the other work, or is it just the old photographs and drawings that show the horses?
So the records that I looked at, and Cressman, they tend to be a lot earlier than the time that you're going to have for horse, which was coming in with Euro-American contact in the late 1700s, early 1800s. Hey, Cheryl Mack on the call. She probably could answer this question. I wish you were in the room because she's very familiar with some of that ethnohistoric literature. But so, some of the questions you've raised and Jim was raising about more of that time in between the ethno-historic period, and then current reflections that indigenous people have, and the road cut, there is a big gap of time. And it's a bit difficult to bridge that based on the archaeology right now.
All right, it's looking like a couple more questions. One here from the chat. Is there any effort to preserve the site as a sacred site in the future by tribal groups?
So I don't know about that sacred site aspect. The site is on the National Register of Historic Places. It was put on there in 1974. I actually tried to get a hold of that that register document to see what criteria had been used to put it on the register. I have a feeling that it was about the scientific value and less on the cultural values and sacred values. And I think it would be worth looking at that and maybe updating that record, as well as some of these other places in that vicinity that that probably need well, what to say. A lot of those designations don't prevent destruction. They just put a block there to require further evaluation and consultation. And you've kind of raised this issue. Well, I don't. I'll talk to people later about it, but it's something that should be happening. We should be looking at that and thinking about it being more of a traditional cultural property than a national register. Broaden the values that are currently kind of legally connected to it. But I'll say that tribes have a lot of interest in protecting this part of the Columbia, and tribal police are routinely moving around that, making the circuit on I-5 to make sure people are being careful and not disturbing archaeology and cultural resources in that area.
Right.
So following on the sturgeon, an even more difficult organism to find in archaeological sites, the lamprey.
Yes.
Is there any evidence of lamprey usage? And if not, how far down the Columbia do you have to go to find any of that use evidence?
Oh, Dennis, one of the things about lamprey is they are very hard to find evidence for because there's no bone associated with their vertebrae. They have these oral discs that have like a chitin, a type of structure, almost like fingernail horn, but it's very thin. We did, worked with a student several years ago trying to see what kind of evidence that we have for lamprey. We don't have any right now, but I'll say Shelby Anderson is working with the Grand Ronde tribe on a project to carefully look at archaeology and cultural views of lamprey in the Willamette Valley. And I think it's like a lot of things. You just need a search image for what you're trying to find, even though this oral disc that I'm talking about, it's pretty obscure. If you know what you're looking for and you're sorting through materials, it might be there. If you're not sure what it is, you might think, it's just blown in seed pod or a fragment of a leaf or something. I mean, it really is that kind of mental attention.
Thank you.
Any more questions? All right. Oh. All right, we got just a couple more, and then since people are here.
You mentioned that you found the frothy stuff at the top of the excavation, cigarette butts.
Yeah.
Were some of those Luther Cressman cigarettes? My question is really about, what do you know what the relationship of your excavations to his excavations was?
I think that we have a pretty good link to the stratigraphy that we were working in and what he had. I think, and sometimes when we were cutting down those steps, we could actually see their excavation in the wall. I think, and we know where their datum was, and we know where ours was. I mean, I think we're in good stead in putting ourselves in his in that vicinity. For that top area, it's a real mystery of the timing of that. Like the gentleman was talking about the railroads, there was so much happening in that area when I-84 went in, lots of stuff happening. I just had this picture of little bulldozers up on the top of that hill, just shuffling stuff around. And it didn't impact the deep materials, but that uppermost part is all churned up.
Okay, so thinking back 9,000 years ago, from a mammalion's perspective, you would have otters, mink, you'd have bobcats, you'd have weasels,
Skunk.
you'd have coyotes.
Yeah.
You go on from there. Did you see any evidence, or did Cresswell get any evidence of any of those mammal species?
Had a few what I would call small mammals, carnivores, skunk. He had coyote. He had a handful. He had some phosid seals. There were like 9 specimens of those. We didn't get any of that. Our non-fish is small rodents that may or may not be cultural. I don't think we got a carnivore tooth. So that kind of asked, I have these questions like, Terry was talking about. Are you sure you were in the place where Cressman was? And how did we cut through a place that didn't have any of those big birds? It's, I don't know. And I think there are a lot of questions about the lack of match between what we had and what Cressman had. But I think there's more that matches that suggests we were in the right place. But I'll say that for that small mammal story, there weren't very many that were recovered. I would say 200 specimens overall.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Butler, for giving that talk.
Thank you all.
I think it was great. Thank you all for coming here tonight and tuning in on Zoom as well. Hi. Final announcements. If you do want to get into basic training, right now the PayPal is having some issues. If you want to email OAS training 2025@gmail.com, we can get you signed up. But also come over on February 4th to OMSI to see our next talk or next public lecture with Dr. Karen Steelman, the Shumla Archaeological Research and Education Center. So we'll talk about state-of-the-art dating processes for rock art. But thank you all for showing up and have a great day.
Thank you so much.
You're rolling with a bunch of there too.
Good night, everybody.
So I don't know how to turn this off.
Yeah.
Jim, I know how you got these things like.